So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Digital Programming, a special event. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Now our guests for this conversation, a partnership event between the Hagan History Center and the Erie Civil War Roundtable in the Jefferson Educational Society, are Mr. Brian Graff, retired geographer and cartographer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Mr. George Deutsch, historian, author, and executive director of the Hagan History Center. Together, they'll review the brief history of raising Union black regiments during the Civil War. Here they're going to focus on several USCT, which was known as the United States Colored Troop Regiments, that were partially recruited in Northwestern Pennsylvania. Muster rolls, service records, pension records, medical records, etc. were used to perform groundbreaking original research, which we'll unpack here. Individual black soldiers were identified and described who enlisted and were drafted in the city of Erie, Waterford, and Meadville. U.S. Navy service by local black men will also be addressed, and post-USCT residents of the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home in Erie will also be covered. Interesting stories of individuals will enrich the research discussed with the audience here in this event. Now, before we get into the event, a bit about our presenters and a bit about Mr. Deutsch first. George has co-founded several historical organizations related to the Civil War and the War of 1812 in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's also helped create the flagship Niagara League, which played a central role in reconstructing the U.S. brig Niagara and creating the Erie Maritime Museum. An historian and author, he annually teaches courses, history courses at the Chautauqua Institution, and for more than 3 decades has given numerous presentations on Civil War history across 7 states, as well as the District of Columbia. He's been published in numerous journals and also served as a consultant to National Geographic magazine for its Civil War sesquicentennial issue. He earned a degree in history from Mercyhurst University and was also educated at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And of course, he's no stranger to the Jefferson stage and the Jefferson's digital programming, as he's presented on a range of topics from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Civil War to the great antagonists, President Lincoln and Chief Justice Taney, and contentious presidential elections. Now, also a bit about Mr. Graff. Brian is a retired federal employee who moved to Erie from Washington, D.C. in 2016, who's making his Jefferson Educational Society programming debut, as well as a debut for the Erie Civil War Roundtable. A geographer for the government, he had a varied career with service at the Defense Mapping Agency, the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, Brian earned his bachelor's degree in geography at Florida Atlantic University in 1977, a master's in geography at the University of Illinois in 1983, and another master's degree in strategic science from the Joint Military Intelligence College in 2006. His master's thesis earned the 2005-2006 Fleet Admiral Chester Nimowitz Award for Excellence in Archival Research. Since coming to Erie, Mr. Graff has volunteered at various organizations, one of which was the Erie County Historical Society, the Hagan History Center. It was while volunteering at the Historical Society that Mr. Graff performed archival research on the recruitment of black soldiers in Northwest Pennsylvania. Now, since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson Educational Society's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you're listening to or watching a later broadcast of this program, still feel free to send us your questions and comments, and we'll get them along to our presenters to keep the conversation going, keep you engaged in the dialogue with this programming. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mr. George Deutsch, Mr. Brian Graff, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you, Ben.
All right, George, over to you. You're going to kick us off and get things started.
I am going to kick us off, and I think we're going to begin with a little bit of an overview with this first slide in the background. This all goes back, believe it or not, to 1995, 25 years ago. I purchased a set of Civil War documents from a former Civil War paymaster's family here in Erie. Later, when I closely reviewed them, I discovered that the muster rolls contained 2 regiments from the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, and contain numerous names of men enlisted here in Northwestern Pennsylvania, Waterford and Erie County, and Meadville and Crawford County especially. This was a real surprise because I knew that the black population here at that time was very small. I checked the census records and verified that there are only about 40 men of African descent of military age living here according to the 1860 count. What had I stumbled upon? Was there a large population here living off the books? I didn't know. Like any hypothesis, it needed to be tested and proven or disproven. However, life put the research on the back burner for a long time. Before I moved away a few years later, I donated copies to the Erie County Historical Society's archives. After a long hiatus, I returned to Erie to become the executive director of the Historical Society and decided to dust off the research project. After doing some preliminary research at the National Archives, I began to sense that this would be a bigger and more complex story than I had originally supposed. That's when I knew, quite frankly, that I'd need more time than I could devote. Fortunately, I discovered that Brian Graff, one of our new volunteers, had an interest and a knack for research. So I persuaded him to meet me in DC for a research trip. And there he ended up spending an additional week at the archives. I really unleashed a tiger on this project. Most of what you'll see tonight is the product of Brian's long hours of dedicated research and analysis. Spoiler alert, we didn't discover some large underground community, but the story we've developed turns out to be fascinating nonetheless. What you'll hear tonight just scratches the surface of our research. There are many dozens of stories of men of color who joined the Union Army to fight for freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. Their stories shout out for a major scholarly paper, a master's thesis, or even a dissertation. Brian, next.
Okay.
So a quick outline of what we're doing tonight. We're going to provide a brief history of recruiting Black soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War. We're going to provide a background of raising Black regiments in Pennsylvania. We're going to describe the Erie County Historical Society's archival research on the recruitment of Black troops, Usct, in Northwestern Pennsylvania. And as Ben mentioned, other Northwestern Pennsylvania men joined the Navy and on the steamer Michigan, which was home ported in Erie, serving as an important recruiting vessel. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the PA Soldiers and Sailors Home here in Erie, which housed many former Usct veterans. In our research, we've been lucky to come across several photographs. This is one of them of Issam Hayes from the 45th Usct, who enlisted here in Erie on June 7th of 1864. Next. First slide, getting into the meat of this, is of Frederick Douglass. He was a true force of nature, and he plays an important role in the process of bringing men of color into the Union Army. During the Civil War, he as a former slave and an ardent abolitionist, he was a major advocate of recruiting Black men to fight for the Union. He played a critical role in shaping the political debate over Black military service. He's been quoted many times on the subject, but this quote perhaps best captures his argument. Once let the Black man get upon his person the brass letters US. Let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth or under the earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. That was April 6th, 1863. Let's go on next. But there were inherent barriers to the recruitment of Black soldiers into the Army. First, starting with the Militia Act of 1792, back in those days, we did not have a standing army. Our army was made up of state militias, which would amalgamate together in time of crisis. So at the beginning of the Civil War, there was no provision to allow Black men in the Army. The Militia Act of 1792 was a barrier. It provided for the organization of state militias in service of every, quote, free, able-bodied white male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45. Black men were barred from serving these militias. It was the law of the land going into the Civil War in 1861. So even though there are many free Black men in the North who were willing to fight, they were prohibited. Next. But there was a movement to start to bring those willing men into the Army. But it was a slow process. The first, in 1861, early in the war, there were a few senior Union officers who acted on their own initiative to declare slaves free and promoted their enlistment. The first, Major General Benjamin, as the Confederate ladies in New Orleans called him, the Beast Butler. He was a prominent Massachusetts politician and abolitionist. He was commander of Fortress Monroe on the tip of the Virginia Peninsula on the lower Chesapeake Bay in 1861. He took in and protected hundreds of slaves who had run away from nearby plantations and refused to return them to their owners. He labeled them as contraband of war, essentially seized property of those supporting the rebellion. Contrabands became a well-used phrase. Later that year in 61, the Confiscation Act was an attempt to set a consistent policy throughout the Army. It was an act of Congress permitting court proceedings for confiscation of any property being used to support the Confederacy, including slaves. Remember, at this time, slaves were property. Later in August of 1861, General John C. Fremont, commander of the Union Army of the West, declared martial law in Missouri. Missouri was one of those states that was held into the Union by the point of the bayonet. While it was a slaveholding state, it was still part of the Union. Lincoln was not willing to alienate the population of this border state that he was trying to hold into the Union. Fremont was reprimanded for this act. His order was revoked, and he was removed from command. He jumped the gun a little too quickly. The next man you see was General David Black Dave Hunter, and he earned his name while commander of the military Department of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. He issued an order in early 1862 freeing all the slaves in those areas under his command and suggested raising black regiments of the former slaves. This order too was countermanded, returning the slaves to their former status at that point in care of the federal government. Next. So why did the Lincoln administration revoke these early efforts to free slaves and raise black regiments? There's several reasons. After the fall of Fort Sumter in April of 1861 and Lincoln's call for Union troops to put down the rebellion, 4 more southern states seceded: Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and most importantly, Virginia. However, there are 4 border states, all slaveholding, that stayed in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. The number of slaves in those states was roughly 430,000, about 10% of the total enslaved peoples in the country. Lincoln knew he couldn't afford to alienate these 4 states. Thus, freeing the slaves and creation of black regiments was not a practical policy at this time. While Northern abolitionists were very vocal in their desire to free slaves, Lincoln knew that there was much division in the North on freeing slaves. Even if the slaves were freed, what was to be done with them? Also, racism was common in the northern states, and most of the men in the Union Army were truly fighting to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. So early on, there was not universal or even widespread sentiment in the North for emancipation. Next. But there were gradual steps toward the enlistment of black troops. These are the key steps. Next came in July of 1862, 2 acts from the Congress. The first, the Militia Act of 1862, empowered the president to enroll persons of African descent for any war service for which they may be found competent, including service as soldiers. This essentially voided the Militia Act of 1792, but a significant component of the act was a pay set for black men less $10 versus $13 a month than white soldiers. But this actually was not necessarily racist in and of itself, but it reflected the widespread expectations that the blacks would be used for labor only, freeing white troops for combat. And so the combat troops would get more money. Plus, this was still a state-administered system, and most northern states had no interest in enlisting black soldiers. So the act actually failed in practice. But shortly after that, in the same month, came the Confiscation Act of 1862. It contained the first definitive provisions for freeing slaves in the Confederate States. Southerners who were deemed traitors were to be punished by having their slaves confiscated and freed. The most significant change over the first Confiscation Act was the final status on escaped slaves. The first act did not make any determination on the final status of slaves after the war was over. The second act explicitly said that all slaves covered under it would be permanently freed. The second Confiscation Act also prohibited anyone in the military from returning escaped slaves, even slaves that escaped from Union states that still had legal slavery. The second Confiscation Act prepared the way legally for the Emancipation Proclamation and settled the problem about what the Army should do with slaves in their jurisdictions. The act also empowered Lincoln to, quote, employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of the rebellion, and organize and use them in such a manner as he may judge best for the public welfare. A broad interpretation of this would include enlisting them in the Army. However, Lincoln did not immediately act on this provision. Next. It took a few months until he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was created by Lincoln as a War Powers Act, effective only through the end of hostilities, and today is absolutely widely misunderstood. Specifically, it freed slaves only in the areas still in rebellion, since Lincoln, who was a scholar of the Constitution as a lawyer, believed that he did not have the constitutional authority to seize the property of law-abiding citizens. Additionally, an increasing number of freed slaves or contrabands had to be dealt with more systematically. The former slaves whose services once worked for the benefit of the Confederacy could now possibly be used by the Union. One of the key provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation was a new national policy, not a state militia policy, but a national policy of enlisting men of African descent into military service. Lincoln said specifically, and I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, position stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sort into said service. This was a significant game changer for the war effort, and it was the first significant step on the path to citizenship. Now I'll turn it over to Brian. So much for the background and outline of what we're doing, and he will get into much of the detail of our research. Brian?
And hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. After the Emancipation Proclamation, the first Black regiment started to form, primarily in occupied areas of the South. 3 came from Louisiana, 1 from South Carolina, and 1 from Kansas. And in the North, the 54th Massachusetts was formed as portrayed in the 1989 film Glory. Frederick Douglass, he was a recruiter for the 54th Massachusetts, and 2 of his sons enlisted in that regiment. Recruiting extended for free Black men into Pennsylvania, especially in Philadelphia. There were actually more men who came from Pennsylvania, over 300, than Massachusetts, 133. Other northern states were slower to embrace creating Black regiments. But Black regiments faced formidable obstacles, and George hit on one of these. For example, they originally paid less than white troops. This was not resolved until a year later, in June 15, 1864, when federal Congress granted equal pay for all soldiers. There was also initial skepticism among some senior Union officers about how to utilize these new Black regiments. Could they really be used in combat, or should they be relegated to fatigue duty or manning fortifications or building fortifications? Finally, in April 1863, the Confederate Congress passed a joint resolution calling for 1, the execution of white officers captured leading Black regiments for inciting servile insurrection, and the re-enslavement of Black soldiers captured in battle. While this was never enacted on a large scale by the Confederacy, Confederate officers on the ground sometimes established their own policies, such as refusing to take Black soldiers as prisoners. But recruiting continued. General Lorenzo Thomas was sent west to raise Black regiments in the freed portions of the Confederate states of Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, and he had good success. But most importantly, in May 1863, the government established the Bureau of Colored Troops to manage the growing number of Black soldiers. Black regiments formed under the purview of the Bureau of Colored Troops would not have state designations. These regiments would be designated as U.S. Colored Troops for short. For example, the first USCT regiment mustered in Pennsylvania was the 3rd USCT, not the Pennsylvania 3rd USCT. And as we have seen, in 1863, the recruitment of Black soldiers began in earnest. At the same time, manpower shortages in the Union Army forced the government to initiate a draft or conscription. This confluence of events helped to drive the recruitment of Black soldiers. And this really can't be stressed enough how much these two events happening at the same time really did drive the recruitment of Black soldiers. And this is why. Enlistment quotas were established for each state. These quotas would then be broken down by congressional district, counties, then districts, and finally townships. Recruitment of troops during the draft was administered through congressional districts. And we're going to see in a few minutes just how this applied to Northwest Pennsylvania. Drafts would not be necessary in those areas where volunteers filled quotas. The government provided incentives for volunteers in the form of bounties or bonuses upon enlistment. Standard federal bounty was $300 for a 3-year enlistment term. If not enough volunteers came forward and a citizen was drafted, he still had the option of purchasing his way out for $300, which is called commutation, or hiring a substitute and paying the substitute out of his own pocket. The recruitment of Black volunteers was seen as a way to fill these quotas and avoid or minimize the draft. Black men were thus recruited heavily in the freed areas of the Confederacy and later in the border states. Black men received federal and local bounties and served as substitutes. Local free Black men were eligible to be drafted, same as white men. And here's an example of the results of a draft held in Erie County on August 25th, 1863. So we can see that for this draft, Erie County did not meet the quotas and was forced to perform a draft. Again, now all these men will be drafted. They could file for exemptions, pay the $300, or find a substitute. But again, this newspaper article does show, just the need for recruiting Black troops and how it fed to the recruitment of Black troops. It's difficult to estimate exactly how many Black men served in Union regiments. 179,000 is the most commonly used estimate, but in recent years, the estimates have grown as high as 200,000. A rough estimate is that they comprised about 10% of the Union Army. And by the end of the war, 175 USCT regiments were formed. The Black troops took part in roughly 450 separate engagements. Much of this occurred in the later part of the war, 1864 to 1865, when Union casualties were extremely high and war weariness was becoming a factor. USCT regiments played a major role in the Port Hudson campaign, the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg, Virginia, and the Battle of Usct in Florida. 25 Medal of Honor recipients were Black men. The Black regiments lost a lot of men, 38,000 deaths or 21% of the force. However, 19.4% of the casualties were disease-related. Medical treatment of Black regiments was considered substandard. For Black troops, the ratio was 9-to-1 of disease-related death versus combat-related deaths. For white troops, the ratio was 5-to-3 of disease-related deaths versus combat-related deaths. So now we're going to talk about moving to Pennsylvania specifically. Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania was authorized in June 1863 to begin raising Black regiments. From 1863 to 1865, Pennsylvania put 11 regiments in the field. Since Pennsylvania started a bit later than other Union states, already over 1,000 Black men from Pennsylvania had enlisted in other states. As a result, Pennsylvania actively recruited Black men from other states to enlist in its 11 Black regiments. This worked well since Pennsylvania mustered more Black men than any other Union non-slave state. The number of Black men recruited to Pennsylvania was 8,612. Ohio was second with 5,092. Kentucky, as a Union slave state, was number 1 overall with 23,000 men. And as I've said, recruitment of troops during the draft was administered through congressional districts. And here's a map showing the 25 congressional districts of Pennsylvania during the Civil War. And we're going to zoom in to Northwest Pennsylvania. And using the 19th congressional district as an example, each congressional district was run by a provost marshal out of a headquarters. The 19th headquarters was in Waterford. Many provost marshals were former Union officers who had to leave active service due to wounds. Our provost marshal was one of these. Hugh Campbell, formerly of the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment, was badly wounded at Second Bull Run. By all accounts, he was an able and fair provost marshal. Under the provost marshal would be an enrolling commissioner, a physician to do physicals of recruits, and a recruiting officer. Matt Schlaudecker, formerly of the 111th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment, served as the recruiting officer. All men, black or white, were run through the provost marshal's office in Waterford. But after they enlisted, they were sent to different training camps. And we're going to talk about where the black men were trained. Once black men were enlisted or drafted, they were transported to Camp William Penn for training. This camp was fully functional by July 1863 and was located in Cheltenham Hills, just north of Philadelphia. All 11 USCT regiments trained at Camp William Penn, which amounted to about 11,000 men. This camp was the largest training facility for black troops in the United States and the only camp built specifically for this purpose. No trace of the camp remains, but a roadside marker commemorates Camp William Penn. Colonel Lewis Wagner was the commander of the camp and strongly abolitionist. By all accounts, he ran a disciplined camp and took seriously the training of the men who came under his purview. Like the provost marshal of the 19th district, he was wounded at Second Bull Run. And here's a photograph of one of the regiments in formation, the 25th. What was training like at Camp William Penn? The training matched the standard military training of white troops. In the morning, companies trained individually, and in the afternoon, the regiment trained as a unit. The program was intensive, directed by Colonel Wagner, the staff, and regimental officers. When these regiments left camp, they were well trained. Graduation ceremonies were grand affairs. Guest speakers at regimental graduations included Frederick Douglass at the 3rd USCT graduation in July 1863, and Harriet Tubman in April 1865 for the 24th USCT graduation. Regimental flags were also presented at these ceremonies. And here's the regimental flag for the 24th USCT, the regiment that Harriet Tubman spoke to at graduation. The inscription states, "Let soldiers in war be citizens in peace." And now we're going to get to the research that was performed by the Erie County Historical Society. And what we really want to do is we want to understand the number and backgrounds of the black men who enlisted in Northwest Pennsylvania and into the USCT regiments. Thus, we collected data from primary sources on the USCT men who enlisted or were drafted in the city of Erie, Waterford, or Meadville, and were credited to Erie, Warren, Crawford, Mercer, or Venango counties. And this map shows the extent of our study. As you can see, these 5 counties span 2 different congressional districts, the 19th and the 20th, and were both administered by their own provost marshals. So here's a list of the primary sources that we use to collect information on Northwest Pennsylvania. We started off with muster rolls, and as George said, we started the muster rolls for the 43rd USCT, and he described how he acquired these. These were used to extract the names of the men who enlisted in either Erie, Waterford, or Meadville. But there was 9 other regiments that we needed to collect data on that we did not have muster rolls for, so we had to rely on service records for the remaining regiments. Fold 3, an online source of U.S. military records, contained the scanned service records for every soldier that served in a USCT regiment. By regiment, we looked at the service record of each soldier to see where they enlisted. For those who enlisted in Northwest PA, we collected data on these men, and I will say this was a very labor-intensive project, and it took months. Pension records. We then collected pension records for those men who were credited to Erie County that had pension records. The pension records are stored at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and we made a trip there to make digital copies of these records. Pension records are a very useful source for fleshing out the stories of these soldiers. They often contain accounts of how these men came to enlist in the Army, service experiences, and glimpses of home life. Sometimes, if we were lucky, we even got a photograph, as this one of George Dallas. Medical records were collected at the National Archives, and these are important to the story since illness and disease are a big part of the USCT story. And finally, we used local newspapers that were researched on microfilm at the Heritage Room at Blasco Library. And I do want to compliment the staff at the library for their help. It was my first time using the microfilm there, and they were great help. So now let's just get to the results of the research. What came of all this? 286 men were enlisted or drafted, 205 in Waterford, 78 in Meadville, and 3 in Erie. Thus, roughly 70% of the men enlisted in Waterford. The average age of the men was 25.2 years old, which is comparable to white troops. Youngest recorded man was 18, the oldest was 44. There were 27 unique occupations listed. 2 by far were the most common, laborer and farmer. 57% of the men were laborers and 24% were farmers. Together, those occupations account for 81% of the occupations. The next most common occupations were barber, cook, and boatman. And next, here's a quick graph just showing the number of men by occupation. Again, just showing how there's quite a drop off after the first 2 occupations. But again, you see the wide range of occupations that our men had. When did the men enlist in each regiment? We can see that the numbers were very low. Okay. Here we go. In 1865 and in 1863, the largest number of men who enlisted in 1864. Peak month was June 1864, when we had over 50 men enlist, and they were in the 45th USCT. And the colors here represent the different regiments that were being recruited, and so you can sort of see that multiple regiments were being recruited at any one time, but generally 3 or 4 months was the amount of time that they were recruiting for a regiment. Men who enlisted in Northwest Pennsylvania were born in 25 different states or countries. As can be seen, our men were not all born in northern states. Most of the men were born in 5 states: Kentucky with 90 men, Virginia with 45, Tennessee with 36, Pennsylvania with 25, and Ohio with 18. These 5 states account for 75% of the men. The top 3 states were all slave states: Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, and they all accounted for 60% of the men. Pennsylvania only accounted for 9%. Were any of the men who enlisted in Waterford or Meadville former slaves? The service records did not capture whether a man was a slave or not. So we had to use pension records to help us answer this question. So the pension records we collected, 21 pension records, were from men who were born in slaveholding states. 16 of these men, or 76%, specifically stated that they were slaves before they enlisted. The remaining 5 did not report anything regarding slavery. For those men, we just don't know. For men that we didn't have pension records for, we would just have to infer that if you came from a slave state, it's highly likely that you were a slave. In the case of the data we collected, that would account for a little over 200 men. And how did they get here? So we're going to look at one person's journey, John Stringer. Again, we pieced this together through looking at John Stringer's pension record. And here's how he got to Waterford. He was a slave in Shelby County, Tennessee. In September 1863, he ran away from his master and made his way to Chattanooga and the Union Army. While in Chattanooga, he links up with the 40th Indiana. And while there, he meets another former slave, Logan Crisp. They both become cooks for different companies in the regiment. For the 5 months he's with the 40th Indiana, he's been with them through numerous engagements: the Battle of Chickamauga, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge. So he has some experience with the Army. In February 1864, the 40th Indiana travels home for furlough, and Stringer, Crisp, Presley Cheek, and another former slave go along. So while they're in Indianapolis, Stringer and the rest are met by a Pennsylvania recruiter who arranges transportation to Cleveland and then to Waterford, PA. So that's one slave's journey to Waterford. And I think what's sort of interesting, when you look at the pension records, they never actually describe, like, how did they actually get to Waterford? Like, I'm sort of curious on the process itself. Was it train? Was it wagon? They just say, we went from Indianapolis to Cleveland to Waterford. So the rest of it, you sort of have to infer, or we're going to keep digging. General observations based on pension records. These men did not wait passively to be freed by Union troops. These men took active steps to escape slavery and took risks doing so. They ran off and often found other slaves that they joined up with. These slaves often linked up with Union regiments that were operating nearby. At times, they offered their services to these regiments, often as cooks or servants. This informal service often led to eventual enlistment in the USCT regiments, and John Stringer's journey to freedom was through this method. We also found that Confederate masters or their sons took some of our Black men with them as personal servants when they fought for the Confederacy. In our pension records, both Confederate officers and enlisted men took slaves with them to war. Our men escaped from these Confederate soldiers when they had the opportunity. And finally, Union towns across river borders of free or slave states were popular destinations for escaping slaves and recruiters. A good example of this is Evanston, Indiana, across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky. Before the war, Evanston was a major hub in the Underground Railroad, and this was well known. From the pension records, a number of our men came through Evanston. Was Erie County actively recruiting slaves in the Confederate States? Yes. Recruiters were sent outside of Northwest Pennsylvania to find men who would come here to enlist and be counted against its draft quotas. Erie County provides an example of how agents were used to recruit in the Confederate States. This document, signed by Pennsylvania Governor Curtin on August 2nd, 1864, designates Mr. Richard Boas as recruiting agent on behalf of Erie County for the states of Georgia and Alabama. He left for Atlanta shortly after being appointed. Not much was reported in the papers after that, and this needs to be investigated further. The Erie Weekly Gazette reported on August 18th, 1864, that 3 men from Erie County who had traveled to Fortress Monroe, Virginia to recruit Black men had returned empty-handed. The paper stated, "Contrabands are reported to be scarce and in great demand in that quarter. Agents from the eastern states and New York are there thick as buzzards." Black men were eligible for the same federal bounties as white men, and this did provide some incentives. The usual federal bounty is $300 for a 3-year term of enlistment. As further incentive, local governments such as counties and townships offered their own bounties that would be offered in addition to federal bounties. Did our men get bounties? Yes, we believe they did. The service records do indicate that 150 men enlisted with the promise of federal bounties. According to the service records, 9 men received $200 bounties from Crawford County. Venango County and Mercer County each offered $200 bounties to 1 recruit apiece. This article appeared in the August 25th, 1864 edition of the Erie Weekly Gazette. It shows that Erie County did send a recruiting agent, Mr. John Haldeman, to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, to recruit former slaves, and that he was going to be provided an Erie bounty. However, as this article describes, other states also sent recruiting agents and are prepared to offer higher bounties than Erie County. Erie County did not get any recruits from this trip. In July 1864, it became allowable for Blacks to serve as substitutes for whites. This came at a good time since commutation was eliminated in July 1864. Remember, commutation allowed a drafted conscript to pay $300 to avoid service. Now the only option to avoid service was to find a substitute. This July 4th, 1864 letter from our Provost Marshal, Hugh Campbell, is informing the public that Black men can now be used as substitutes for white men. And did Black men serve as substitutes in Northwest Pennsylvania? Yes, they did. We had a total of 50 men who served as substitutes. Most of the substitutes, 64% of them, occurred in Crawford and Venango counties in the 20th Congressional District. Were these men credited to satisfy conscription quotas? From the service records, these USCT recruits were credited to local townships and by extension to local counties to satisfy recruitment quotas. The majority of the service records are very specific in stating where to assign credit to these men. This table shows the number of men who were credited to each county. And as we can see, nearly half the men were credited to Erie County. And here's a map that shows the spatial distribution of where our men's enlistments were credited by township. And again, you can note the large number of townships in Erie County that had men credited to them. Mill Creek Township had the most, with 18 men for Erie County, and for Crawford County, Richmond Township had 16 men. But again, this shows the spatial distribution. And here's a question that we're definitely interested in. Did any Black men living in Erie in 1860 serve in USCT regiments? We used the 1860 census of Erie County to help answer this question. The 1860 census showed that 97 Black men lived in Erie County. Only 45 of these would have been of age appropriate to enlist. 13 of these had exemptions. And of the remaining 32 men, 24 men who were in the 1860 census were not in the 1870 census. We don't really know where they went. So we uncovered 5 men. William Titus was the earliest to enlist, and he joined the 54th Massachusetts in April 1863. Unfortunately, he came down with dropsy or general inflammation of the body and died in Revoke, Massachusetts. He never left the training camp. William Chrysler and David Jacobs both enlisted as substitutes after the Provost Marshal announced that Black men could substitute for white men. Erie County had 2 Black men who were drafted, James Davis and Jeremiah McConnell. They were drafted near the very end of the war. Davis was drafted in Ridgeway after the Provost Marshal moved his office there from Waterford. McConnell was not drafted into a USCT regiment, but was placed in a white regiment, the 98th Pennsylvania. And how is this possible? He is listed in the 1860 census as mulatto, so perhaps that was part of the answer, but we really don't know how this happened. And we're just gonna take a real quick look at one of these Erie men, William Chrysler. He's a resident of Union Township, and the thing that really stands out here is the discrepancy in the ages between the 1860 census and his Army service record. According to the census, he would have been 54 years old. According to his service record, when he enlisted, he was 42 years old. He'd definitely been too old to enlist if we were going by his census age. So we're gonna find out which one is correct by looking at his service, at the pension records. And here's William Chrysler's Civil War. He enlisted in August 1864 in Meadville in the 127th Regiment. He trained at Camp William Penn, and while there got sick with fever and dysentery. He was at Camp Hospital from November 1864 to February 1865 for 4 months. Either sick or serving as an attendant. He rejoined this regiment just in time for the fall of Richmond and the surrender of General Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia in April 1865. He got sick again in May 1865 and went to the hospital at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. The Civil War is now over, but many Black regiments were sent to Texas-Mexico border for border patrol, and the 127th was one of these regiments. Chrysler gets out of the hospital and goes with the regiment to Texas, where he gets sick again, resulting in hospitalization in New Orleans and Baltimore. Finally, he gets discharged for disability. In Chrysler's certificate for disability, he admits that his age is 59, and the doctors conclude that he is suffering from general disability caused by old age. So he was actually 57 when he enlisted, which is actually quite old for a Civil War soldier. But that is William Chrysler's Civil War, and it does sort of illustrate, again, how relevant disease was to many of these soldiers. He spent quite a bit of time in Union hospitals. And finally, to conclude, what happened to the men who came through Northwest Pennsylvania? 169 men survived the war and mustered out of their companies, nearly 60%. 39 men died, 14% of the men that were mustered, 36 of illness in the hospital. So the ratio of death by disease to combat deaths by these men was roughly 9-to-1, which matches the ratio I talked about earlier. 11% of our men deserted, which is comparable to white regiments. And that concludes my part. George, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know I went through that very fast, and it's a lot to absorb. I'm trying to catch my breath here a little bit, but I'm going to turn it over to George now.
Thanks, Brian. So there were other services, and the Navy is quite different from the Army. If we go back in time to the early Republic, there were Black sailors on the ships of the Continental Navy, the early American Militia Navy. They served at sea for this whole time. And finally, in 1798, there was an official prohibition passed that the Navy would no longer have Black sailors. However, it was never enforced. Informally, there were, throughout this period, there were always Black sailors on the few Navy ships that were out there, plus many of the privateers and merchantmen that were sailing from the East Coast. During the War of 1812, there was an act passed in March of 1813 that officially integrated the Navy. The Navy records are fairly opaque, and I'll mention this a couple different times, but they just didn't register who was black or who was white. We just don't know. Estimates, most of the estimates that I see reasonably range from 15 to 20% of the Navy during the War of 1812 were black. It ranges from as low as 7%, which I think is too low, to as high as 50%, which I think is too high. So I'm very comfortable with this middle range of 15 to 20%, but that is a significant number of men of color who serve in the Navy without the Navy registering race, which I think is kind of a significant piece of information in and of itself. So by the start of the Civil War, our Navy was rather small. The best estimates are approximately 5% of the sailors during the Civil War. At the beginning of the Civil War, 1860, were black. However, the Navy rapidly expanded, and there was heavy recruiting for black sailors, especially along the Northeast coast, Philadelphia, the Chesapeake, Boston, etc. And ultimately, nearly 18,000 men of color served in the Navy, about 23% of the entire Navy that were enlisted during the war. Approximately 1,200 men came from Pennsylvania. Many of those were enlisted upon in the Michigan, which was the first iron-hulled warship in the U.S. Naval Service, which was home ported in Erie. And the Michigan became a very important recruiting station. My estimates from other research is that approximately 1,000 men from Erie County joined the Navy and were recruited through the Michigan. So Erie was a very important naval station during the war. Next. Research in Navy records, as I mentioned, is much more opaque than the Army. The records just are not as orderly or even extant. So far we've been able to identify only 2 local black men who had volunteered for naval service, and more research may well turn up more men. The first one of these is James Grant, and again, he was recruited upon Michigan, and he was born in Erie in 1843. He lived in the East Ward of the city and worked as a waiter. His naval service, he did 2 tours, one early in the war and one late in the war. Both times he was enlisted on the Michigan. He served on a total of 7 ships during his service in the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron and the Gulf Blockading Squadron. Interestingly enough, his last ship that he served on was the flagship of the Gulf Blockading Squadron. Sometime after the war, he moved to Chicago, and he lived there from about 1880 to his death in 1916. Next. This next name may be familiar to some of you, especially from Erie County, but it should be a familiar name nationwide. This is Harry Thacker Burley Sr. We'll talk about his son, Harry Jr. in a moment. Harry Sr. was born in Boston in 1836. He moved to Erie sometime around 1860. You can see he's a striking looking man from his photograph. He actively worked, once he moved to Erie, with other black citizens, including Hamilton Waters and the Vosburgh family, who were leaders against slavery and for equal rights. He helped create and develop the colored school in Erie and became its first superintendent, a major step in educating the black community. In 1862, he married Hamilton Waters' daughter, and he entered naval service in 1864 and 1865. Next. When he returned to Erie, oh, by the way, the photograph on the right is the one ship he served on, which was the tin-clad Moose. We don't have a photograph of the Moose, but its sister ship, the Rattler, And these ships served in what was called the Brown Water Navy. In other words, on the rivers, such as the Ohio and the Mississippi and the Tennessee and the Columbia in the Western theater of the war. When Harry returned to Erie, he and his wife Elizabeth had a son, Harry Thacker Burley Jr. But that just wasn't the extent of Harry Sr.'s story. He continued as a racial pioneer. He was the first Black juror in Erie County courts. He mustered into the Grand Army of the Republic, the Veterans Unit, the GAR, Strong Vincent Post number 67, as the first Black man to be mustered into that post. There would be several others over the course of the next decade or so, but he was the leader. He was the man that broke down that door. By 1871, he was a conductor, which is an important position at that time on the Lakeshore Railway and then later the Michigan Southern Railway. He died from a heart attack on the job in Chicago in February of 1873 at the age of 36. He'd be returned to Erie and buried in the Erie Cemetery. Now, I mentioned a couple times his son, Harry Jr. Who was Harry Jr.? I can talk for an hour on him. He became one of the most important composers in American history, born here in Erie, made his fame in New York, and he is credited to be the savior of the Black spirituals. These songs, which are passed from person to person, generation to generation, he wrote them down, arranged them, and saved many of the spirituals that you know commonly today. Again, a native son of Erie, one of the most important composers in American history, and the son of an American naval veteran from the Civil War. Next. By white men. There were no Black officers enlisted. By the end of the war, there were actually a small handful, I think it's under 10 out of the 180,000 men that served that were promoted up the ranks, but overwhelmingly white officers commanded these troops. And unlike the state volunteer units, which often were, the officers were either elected by the troops or politically appointed, these men actually had to apply to become an officer, to take a test for competence and knowledge. So these men really became the cream of the crop of the junior officers. Most of them were veterans of the war. They were enlisted men who wanted to move up and did not have a path in their own white units. And they would take these tests, become leaders of these Black units, and put their lives on the line, because the capture of a man leading a white man leading a Black unit was not something that, especially because of the death sentence that the Confederate Congress imposed, was not something to be taken lightly. The man on the right, an Erie County teacher, young Erie County teacher, who enlisted in the 83rd Pennsylvania at the beginning of the war. His name is Oliver Wilcox Norton. Little aside from him, he helped compose and was the first man to sound taps, the famous lights out and funeral dirge that we all know from the military. So besides his claim to fame to that, he remained a private through most of the war, and finally after the Battle of Gettysburg, after his commander, Strong Vincent, who he was very close to in his personal aid, had been mortally wounded, I think Norton decided he needed to move up. He wanted to become an officer. He felt he deserved it. Passed the test, became a lieutenant in the 8th USCT, fought in at least one major battle and several skirmishes, would become the adjutant of the regiment before it mustered out. One last note, Norton would go on to become a multimillionaire, one of the richest men in the country by the end of the century. Next. And then finally, we're going to talk about the what happens to many of these men after the war. Hold on. I had to tell my dog to quit being a guard dog. Anyway, the Soldiers and Sailors Home is a fascinating place. It was established in Erie in 1886. It was the first of 6 Soldier and Sailors Homes that were established for military veterans in Pennsylvania. It's still maintained today as a modern facility caring for the needs of an aging veteran population. And it was an integrated facility from the start, something that was very progressive for its time. It contains a chapel with beautiful stained glass windows as a memorial to the Civil War soldiers. The 4-acre Veterans Memorial Cemetery is the final resting place for over 1,300 men and women, and those graves dating from the Civil War era to today. Next. There are 28 men who initially lived from the USCT that lived in the Soldiers and Sailors Home, including 4 white officers. 2 of those men had enlisted in Waterford and 1 in Ridgeway. We have over on the right a drummer boy who would eventually live at the Soldiers and Sailors Home. His name was William Anderson from the 27th USCT. This is another one of those fabulous photographs that we found at the National Archives. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to our local historian, Kathy Hauser, who before Brian and I ever started this project, identified the 28 men from the USCT that lived in the Soldiers and Sailors Home. And I had mentioned the cemetery. That's a photograph of the cemetery as it appears today. 17 regiments were represented from different Pennsylvania counties. 26 of these men applied for invalid pensions. 20 were approved. We have copies of all those in our Historical Society database. 13 widows applied for widow pensions. 9 were approved. 13 of those men are interred at the Veterans Memorial Cemetery, 3 in the Erie Cemetery, 1 in Meadville, and 1 in Elgin, Erie County. Next. But before we do the conclusion, I jumped ahead because Brian's going to handle that. I did want to mention that we have many human interest stories from the dozens upon dozens of men that we've been able to develop their story. And this is just one I found related to the Soldiers and Sailors Home that is both illustrative and is poignant. Jerry Jackson from the 41st USCT. This is primarily a case of a widow trying to establish that she was legally married to Jerry. Widows, whether black or white, had to prove their marriages to the pension board by getting affidavits from the minister who conducted the ceremony, other witnesses, or even sending in their own marriage certificates like my great-great-grandmother had to do to prove that she was married to my great-great-grandfather. I held their original marriage certificate in my hands at the National Archives. It was pretty cool. The problem with slave marriages, though, is that they weren't legally recognized in the South and almost never recorded. There's a letter in the file from the widow stating that she was a free woman, but had married Jerry when he was a slave in December of 1864 in Frederick County, Maryland. The pension file is a nice letter by a neighbor who saw the soldier and his wife on a train in Frederick when he was going off to war. The son of the man who owned Jerry also sent a letter stating that he knew him and of the marriage. He really seemed to like Jerry, and there are many letters in his pension file from white people who knew Jerry as a slave. After the war, they moved to Pennsylvania, and although she claimed 15 children from the marriage, it was fraught with separations, including when he moved to the Soldiers and Sailors Home. While there, he wrote several letters addressing her as his dear wife and signing off as her affectionate husband. He pleaded with her to join him in Erie, but apparently she'd taken up with another man and refused to come. The sad irony of this story is that after his death in 1899, she used those very letters from him to press her claim as his legal wife in order to collect his pension. That's just one of dozens of interesting stories of the African-American men who served their country that are contained in the pension files, medical and service records that we have amassed in the Erie County Historical Society archives. We're open by appointment for researchers and welcome those researchers to make use of our facilities. You can find us at eriehistory.org and make an appointment if you are interested in finding out more. And now I will turn to Brian, and he will conclude our talk.
Yeah, I'm just going to wrap. We covered a lot of ground here, I know. So I'm just going to try to pull everything together very quickly. Black troops played a significant role in the Civil War. Pennsylvania contributed a large number of Black men in USCT regiments. 286 men, at least, came through Northwest Pennsylvania based on active recruitment outside the region to fill the Black regiments, and most of these recruits were from slaveholding states. The draft was a major driver in the recruitment of Black men to serve in Black regiments, especially to help satisfy the draft quotas. Local Black men did serve, even though the numbers of local Black men were few. We covered Black sailors in the Union Navy and described 2 local Erie men who enlisted. And finally, we concluded with a brief overview of USCT soldiers in the Pennsylvania Soldiers and Sailors Home. And that pretty much concludes our talk this evening. Thank you.
So Brian, George, I've got to echo one of the comments we have in the comments section from one of our watchers who says, very, very interesting, impressive research. So thank you both so much for what you've done here. It is groundbreaking work. Like you said, this is the first presentation of the research you've been working on. I just want to save a few minutes here for a couple of questions at the end to talk to you about the experience, in particular, that very, very impressive research that you've done. And I want to ask you, I know that researchers don't always carry around a stopwatch with them and click it every time they start working and unclick it every time they stop, but give us a sense of how much time you spent on this project, how many hours went into the researching, the working with microfiche, the time in archives. How long did you each spend on this project?
Well, you want me to start, George, or?
Sure.
Well, again, I started here on this project in the summer of 2017 when George, just laid out on a desk in front of me this muster roll and just said, hey, start looking up names of people enlisted, in Erie or Meadville. And just doing one regiment took me all summer, and I transferred this information to a notebook and then to a spreadsheet. And then when we didn't have other muster rolls, we had to start again using Fold 3, the online database, and look up names individually for the 10 remaining regiments. That took months. And again, we were just collecting very basic information, just the names of the men and where they enlisted. Once we went to the National Archives and started collecting pension records and started seeing a lot of references to escaping from slave states, we started realizing there's a story here beyond just a local story. And then we had to go back to the service records on Fold 3 and collect much more information from those records to flesh out where they were born, how old they were, things like that, which was the basis for the presentation today. And that took months. So this it was very labor intensive, very time consuming, but also very exciting. And it was great to spend time with George at the National Archives. George, you could describe that, how we're there all day just standing, like taking pictures. If you want to talk about, and if you want to add anything, George.
Sure. Again, first time I took the data from the very first regiment that we had, this 43rd, to the archives, I realized that this was going to be a monster project time-wise. And so first time through, I spent about a week's vacation, mostly at the archives, and then came back to Erie and recruited Brian. And we went a second time. I was there a day with him, and then I left him there for a week. And I've been back a couple more times. I think I've easily put in well over 100 hours doing research in the archives that I can account for. Other research, it's hard for me to tell. I mentioned at the beginning, Brian has done the lion's share. thank God he's retired. And but this has been a 3-year project to get to the point we're at.
So, George, you've called Brian a lion and a tiger, a bear. Oh my, I didn't hear bear, but he is such a force on this project. We're so grateful to have him and his commitment there. Brian, you did such a great job, I think, recapping the end of what our takeaways are and the conclusion, and I appreciate that. So my final question here, before we conclude tonight's program, is really oriented in next steps. I appreciate in particular, for instance, all of what you've done, but in particular, I really appreciate you tracking down the movement of individual soldiers. Wow, those maps of being able to follow a soldier's path, particularly follow a path out of slavery and into the war, and then be able to follow them along. So are you looking to do that with more individual soldiers, map their individual paths to find out where they were, how they moved throughout the country? Or in other words, just generally, what are the next steps for the two of you with this project? Where are you headed? Brian, we can start with you. George, we'll end with you.
Well, one thing I would like to do is I would like to, I definitely, if you want to look at the pension records, to come up with more narratives, from the men who came to either Waterford or Meadville, to try to develop those and look at the connections, connect the dots between some of these men. In the case of Stringer, I mean, there was definitely looking at multiple pension records of different men who knew each other and connecting dots, and then just cross-checking their stories to see if they matched. And more of that needs to be done. And George, you can attest to this. These pension records can be hundreds of pages. I mean, you could spend, well, maybe years looking at the amount of pension records we acquired. I also would like to spend some time just cleaning up the data. I mean, as we've been working along preparing for this presentation, I spotted some inconsistencies in our spreadsheets, that I want to fix. And then I want to just also write up a final report that captures everything that we know so far that can be maybe handed off to someone else, just a way to put a bow on everything. So, because it is like an octopus.
So George and Brian, you have a lion and a tiger. Are you getting a bear? What's the next steps for you?
Well, as Brian mentioned, some of these pension records can be hundreds of pages long. They are really, you can think that the service records are kind of the meat and potatoes, but the gravy are the pension records, because they are so full of valuable information. And sometimes it's just a sentence or a line. There's tens of thousands of pages of pension records that we've collected in our database. And I'm hopeful that some enterprising graduate student will come along and be able to tackle this and really spend a significant amount of additional time beyond what we have, and pull more stories out. I can tell you that, we probably have a few dozen more stories that are interesting, just like I did the one on the fellow from the Soldiers and Sailors Home, or we did on Chrysler. There's another story that I didn't even touch on about troops of mixed race from Erie County who served in Erie County units. So it's very expansive, and we probably will come back and do another talk at some point. But I think the amount of information that we've been able to accumulate, the raw data, really needs somebody who will find an incentive as a graduate student or something to come in and really mine and be able to create even things that are more interesting, pull more things that are interesting out of it, and be able to use it pretty profitably for academic and maybe even a book.
So on behalf of the Jefferson Educational Society, and I hope on behalf of, I can say, the Hagen History Center, as well as the Erie Civil War Roundtable, George and Brian, we'd absolutely love to have you back as you continue to unpack this research, you continue to follow these stories, and you continue to do the work that you are doing. So to say, an echo of another comment in the comments section. Well done, Brian and George. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and efforts on this research and for sharing it with us here.
Thank you.
And to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. George, Brian, George, I know you mentioned the website, but one more time, where can we point folks who are looking to connect with the Hagen History Center to get more information there, the work you and Brian are doing? Where do we point those folks, George?
My dog has finally decided to jump off it because she's
The most attentive audience.
It's eriehistory.org, and that's
Excellent.
our website. And you can contact me directly. My email's on there. And questions for Brian, I can certainly relay to him.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure we put a link to that in the comment section of this Facebook post and the rest of all the places that we share this information. And of course, for more information about both upcoming programs and past discussions available now for on-demand streaming, please head over to jeserie.org. There you're also going to find a wide range of publications from timely reads on current topics to reports, essays, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to us on our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.